Hello friends, welcome to Exampore. I hope my voice is audible clearly, screen is visible. All is set. तो आज बात करने वाले हैं बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट क्वेश्चन की और बहुत ही इंपॉर्टेंट टॉपिक जो चर्चे में है ऑलरेडी. तो उसकी बात करने से पहले वी शुड बी अवेयर अबाउट व्हाट इज ऑल अबाउट मल्टीलैटरलिज्म एंड व्हाट इज बायलैटरल टाइज. जब बायलैटरल टाइज की बात करते हैं, व्हेन वी डू टॉक अबाउट बायलैटरल एग्रीमेंट्स एंड द मल्टीलैटरलिज्म, देन व्हाट शुड बी द फेवरेबल पॉलिसी इफ वी डू टॉक अबाउट developed countries and the developing countries? Would they make any difference in these criteria if we are taking the developing and developed countries along in the multilateralism? And in today's time, why we are making the preference of bilateral agreements over the multilateral agreement, we need to know about it. So before going forward, we are going to discuss regarding the question multilateral negotiation. What do we mean by multilateral negotiation? Multilateral is, it's a group of many countries. Many countries. What do we mean by it? 15 to 16, 20 countries, like more than 4, 5, 6, 7. These are the multitasking countries. If we do talk about bilateral agreement, then we need to focus on the criteria. It has to deal with only two countries. If we are talking about bilateral agreement, we need to make a focus. We have to deal with only two economies. Just like in today's time, we can discuss the India and Vietnam ties. And if we do talk about multilateralism, multilateral state. Multilateral means we have to deal with many countries. Okay. So we need to give the preference to whom which agreement we need to focus on. What our question is asking for, multilateral negotiation will be increasingly difficult in present chaotic global situation. Like why the multilateralism is becoming so difficult in today's scenario. We need to discuss about the drawbacks regarding the multilateralism in order to make a favorable point of view towards the bilateral agreements. According to me, if I put forward my viewpoint in a single statement, that if we are considering the bilateral agreements, we can take a view regarding the developing countries, for which sense for whom bilateral agreement is going to be favorable one. Why is it so? In regarding these point of view, we are going to discuss the same. Why we are in the today's situation, why we are discussing this question. First of all, in every sense regarding the answer writing, we need to focus on one point, whether this topic is related to the current update or not. If this is so, we need to put forward 1 or 2 points regarding the same current update. Number 2, if we are talking about current geopolitical situation. Current geopolitical situation has been multilateralism being not able to solve the current issue. Like if we are talking about the multilateral point of view, we need to occupy the agreement with some standard which are going to be favorable for every country. But if we are considering many countries like RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Agreement key, if we do talk about like RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, from where India has come out due to we were occurring the deficit problems with many of the countries. Why do we occur a kind of problem if we do have to talk about deficit one? I am just taking the example in case of multilateralism in order to understand the clear viewpoint, what do we mean by multilateralism and why this is so unfavorable if we do consider the developing state. Multilateral state, we need to deal with many of the countries. Favorable point of view would be for the developed countries. Why is it so? They are competitive enough in order to expand their production part. Competitive enough to make the thing. And if the things are competitive enough due to the increase in supply, due to having the larger technological base and the large scale businesses, then they are technically upgraded. Technically upgraded due to these reasons. Who is affording? Technically upgraded. If we do talk about the developed state, okay, developed country, if we do talk about the developed country, they are competitive enough and producing the production on the large scale. Plus, if we do talk about the technology, they have to have command over the developing countries. And if we do talk about developing state, they would require a kind of compliance with the countries. Compliance would be easier in case of bilateral agreements. Like if I am making deal, India is making deal the way Vietnam, it would be easier for Vietnam to accommodate with India, and it would be easier for India to accommodate with Vietnam, because only two countries are there for the compatibility aspect. But if we do talk about multilateralism, there would be many countries with whom we need to make the standards, and accordingly things has to be accomplished. Next point, key command of the question, why we are making the favorable aspect and the better aspect regarding the bilateral point. Discuss how the bilateralism is better than the, we need to elaborate certain points. Like as if we are starting up a point regarding the current article writing or answer writing, we need to give a glance regarding the current aspect. If we are giving a glance about the current aspect, means what is the key demand of the question. First point would be always regarding the current aspect, if things has to be accommodated by economic variable. Number two, what is the key demand for the question. Key demand, what this is asking for, bilateral is greater than the multilateralism. If this is so, why is it so? Directive pointers, what pointers we are going to accommodate in the question. We need to give a favorable point of view regarding the bilateral agreement. Why this is so favorable, or if this is so favorable, it is in favor of developing countries and making the persuasive or the encouragement tactics for the developing state. In order to lure or attract the countries, we need to accommodate what? Bilateral agreements. That is what we are talking about in the directive wordings. And multilateral pointers we are going to discuss in these pointers. Multilateral trade agreements, as I have mentioned above, like many of the countries are already included in it. You can take the example for the G7 countries, and you can take the example for RCEP, from where India has come out already, G20 nations. These are multilateral agreements. And you can look at these agreements, who is making the domination in these groups. That would be for, that would go for the developed economies. That credit goes for the developed economies. Why we are saying that bilateral agreement is not at all like favorable in point of view of developed? Because developed countries would always require a kind of market to whom they can serve. I am going to elaborate in detail. First of all, you need to know about it. Reduce the tariff in order to accommodate. Liberal policies would be required for the same, and the standardization would be required. Like multilateral countries, if we do talk about multilateral agreements, multilateral, understand the point. First of all, we need to give the current update for the questions. Current update, why this is so important? What is the key demand for the question? Key demand, like what are the keys we need to make the mentioning in the questions. Key demand is all about multilateral. First, you need to understand the meaning of multilateralism. And second is all about bilateral agreements. Bilateral agreements. If you are talking about the first one, if you do talk about the first one, what do we mean by multilateralism? That is all about, you have to refer a key towards the developed countries. and you can take a hint or glance towards G7, G20 and the RCEP if you are making the consideration of India in that behalf from where India has already come out. Okay. Multilateralism, it is making the group of 3 or more countries, more nations, wherever this multilateralism is asking for the liberal policies so that resources could be utilized fully. Resources could be utilized fully. With reference to resource utilization or the exploitation, this would be the better agreement. If we do talk about in economical sense or the environmental point of view, this would be the favorable policy. Next point we can click on bilateral agreements. Why? You can take out the reason of India, why India has come out from this regional comprehensive economic partnership. What could be the drawback out of it? You can snatch out some drawback. First is less competitive. Why we are so uncompetitive or less competitive? Why this is so? Why we are clicking on this point? The main point why we are making the sense out of it, that is less production. Even if we are producing more and more, we do already possess a big market that could be absorbed by the production part. What I am saying here is, even if we are producing 100 units, we do have that much of market to make the absorption of this production part. To make the absorption of this production part, or absorption means, what do we mean by absorption? Means they can consume. Production, whatever production we are producing on the large scale, we do have that much of population to consume the stuff out of it. Next point we can talk about less competitive. We have already mentioned we did have a kind of deficit problems. Due to that deficit, outflow was more. That is losing on the credibility part. That could be the favorable. And the in multilateralism agreements, we need to state some standardization norm which has to be maintained at the extent. To the extent we need to maintain the standardization, which is not so in case of bilateral agreements. So that could be considered in favor of developing countries, because developing countries want a kind of a strata or the decorum which would be in favor of those countries. Okay. So what else we can talk about here is, so we are trying hard to making the liberal policies trying to make the reduction in the tariffs, so that liberal policy could be accommodated and resources could be utilized thoroughly. Next point, these agreements standardize the business operation, commerce regulation and fair labor standard. What I'm talking about is, you need to maintain the standardized norm. If you have to deal with many countries, you need to have proper framework regarding the standards, regarding the code of conduct which has to be followed among those wide range of countries. But this is not so in case of bilateral agreements. There has to have the trust issues. If you are compatible to make agreement with me, or I am comfortable with you to make agreement with you, this is all set. This is quite easier in comparison to the multilateral task. Or multilateral, good afternoon Dharmendra, this is so easier task, or developing countries prefer to have the easier task rather than opting for the complexities. Next point we can talk about is biggest disadvantage multilateralism. This is complex. What I was talking about is, developing countries always prefer to accommodate the simpler task, from where they need to have less compliance or they has to follow less standardization, because first of all, if they have to maintain certain standards or the code of conduct, they need to transform their own conducts in order to make compliance with the international organization. in order to accommodate those compliances norm, they have to go for a wide range of steps that would be more complex. So in order to avoid that complexity, they prefer to have the bilateral agreement. That is what we are trying to talk about, the developing economies. Plus, developing economies lacks the production part. If they are lacking in production, they want their demand would be higher. If their demand would be higher, they would require the production part. From where you are accommodating that, developed country is making the accommodation criteria for the developing countries. Therefore, they are expanding the base for the production part and the productivity part through the medium of technological upgradation. Next, disadvantage, since trade barrier and disappear, the small businesses cannot compete with giant multinationals. What I was talking about is multilateralism is always favorable for developed countries. I can explain it over here is if we are talking about the multilateralism, why this is favorable for the developed countries. You need to understand about that. Economies. First of all, they do possess the large scale production. Second of all, they do not have that much of less market you can talk about. That makes them more competitive. And if the things are getting more competitive, continuously making the profit out of it, or out of that profit, expanding the base and trying to increase the productivity with the help of technological upgradation. Technological upgraded. So this is only the point. This is why resources are fully exploited. Okay, so these are the plus point you can talk about the multilateralism. If we do talk about in case of bilateral agreements, you need to make the sureties. These are in favor of bilateral agreements. Less complex or simpler, you can write it as, since we are complying less. ठीक है? Second point, less competitive. If you are less competitive, it is going to result in deficit, less technical upgraded, you can talk it about. Okay, less to follow norms. If the things are more easier for the bilateral agreements or the developing countries, we would prefer to make the trade with those countries. Okay. What structure should be opt for? Describe the context. What do you mean by the multilateral aspect? Multilateralism we have already talked about. Thoroughly analysis we have made a point on. Next point, if we are talking about the evolving global order, why we are looking at the nature, posing the questions on the continued relevance of multilateral framework, and mini-lateral and the plurilateral, bilateral can help in framing the targeted partnership that can focus energies on shared interests and concerns. If this is not at all for sure in case of multilateralism, that everybody's interest has to be concerned, has to be taken into the formulation. Okay, if you are dealing with a single economy or the two economy or the three economy, like if you are participating in the organization which are 2 or 3 in numbers, you would be valued in that behalf, your interest would be heard. So in that format, what you need to analyze on, every country is making the elimination or mitigating the aspect of multilateralism. But what do developed economies wanting us to involve in the multilateralism so that they keep on making their market occupation, like they are occupying market? No, we are providing them market, as we are making the demand in the international market and they are supplying their production part. If we will not indulge in such kind of multilateralism, to whom they are going to make the supply? That is the bigger reason they wanting us to involve in the multilateral aspect. But at the same time, if we do talk about the bilateral agreements, it is going to be the favorable for the developed aspect, developed countries. And every country is nowadays wanting themselves to be under the bilateral agreements or the mini agreements, or they do not want to indulge in trade as the international scenario gets disturbed anytime, and disruption causes the imbalance in the BOP, balance of payment. What do we talk about the body? Give reasons why India followed the multilateralism over the years. Why India followed the multilateralism over the years. We have indulged ourselves in the multilateralism. We do need to make the emphasis on the multilateralism in order to make the representative role in certain areas, in the areas, at least for the areas where we can do much better. But if we do talk about bilateral agreements, we are limited to the periphery. But in case of multilateralism, this is the positive point with respect to the developing economies like India. If we are making ourselves involved in the multilateralism, means we are representing the entire world, or we are playing a representative role in the entire global scenario. The face to face, if we are getting ourselves involved in the bilateral agreements, if you are dealing with the 2 people, 4 people, 50 people, 500 people, the more people you are meeting, the more representation you are making of yourself. The same condition goes for the countries. Multilateralism, this is the favorable for the developed countries, but in case of developing countries like India, if they have to make the exploration role, or they have to make themselves indulge for the representative role, they need to deal with the multilateral aspect. If we would have not included ourselves in the multilateral horizon or the agreements, we would have not occupied the place of the software hub in the entire global scenario. Next point, should India change its instance? We have already discussed about it. With reference to the India, with reference to Indian nation, we need to go for the bilateral agreement to make the simplification task. In order to make ourselves explode or simplify the process, for the simplification, we need to go with the bilateral agreement. And second of all, in order to avoid the deficit, Till the time we are not feeling like that we are competitive enough to make trade with the multilateral agreements, we should not go for it, as it is going to result in the deficit part that is going to devalue the rupee, which is already going. And multilateral aspect, what do we look at? Multilateral means many of the point I've already discussed. Multilateral is good for the developed countries. They are large enough to make the compliance with many of the countries' large production laws, or attracts the competition, and competition is going to take huge margin in the profits, and that huge market and the margin would intend or prefer making the sense for the technological upgraded part. Technological upgraded, they are technological upgraded, competition enough, competitive enough, production is so huge, every point is in favor of developed countries. But if you do talk about the India, if India has to maintain or play a representative role in the entire global situation, in the entire global scenario, they have to accommodate with the multilateral agreements. They should not come out of the agreement. Wherever they are occupying their space, at least try to maintain it and play a dominant or the representative role in their preferable sector, wherever they can play the comparative advantage over the resources. The way we are so good at agrarian sector, the way we are so good at a software industry, we can play a very amazing role or competitive role in the multilateral agreements. But in case of other pointers, or in case of other production or the in other industries, if we take the example of the industrial point of view and the manufacturing hub kind of things, we are not so good at it, so we can accommodate in those sectors bilateral agreement. Next point, conclusion, what we can draw regarding the same conclusion, give a balanced point of view. We need to accommodate the multilateral plus the bilateral agreements. We should not show a kind of favorable policy for any one of them. What I am saying is, from the very starting of this lecture, first is all about multilateralism, that is totally in favor of developed countries, and this is totally in favor of developing countries. But you have to give a constructive approach if you are talking about the multilateral aspect. Multilateral, what do we mean by the multilateral aspect? If you have to represent in 30 people, you have to present before 30 people. If you have to represent in 600 people, you have to deal with the 600 people. The same goes with the developing countries. If developing countries has to lure, if developing countries has to attract more countries, then they have to deal with, complex norms and continue making the trade. Okay, in this scenario, in order to represent the thing, like India can represent in many of the sectors, we can perform so good at it. So we can play a diversified role in those segments and be a part of multilateralism. But in case of bilateral agreements, we can say it has to have a limited periphery. In that periphery, we wouldn't be able to represent the entire global situation. So in order to accommodate the entire global situation, we need to deal with many of the countries. So it varies case to case. Every country, what every country is doing in this time, every country is trying to make the protectionism. Protectionism is making them limited to a periphery, and they can make them themselves at least extension towards one or two countries, not towards the multilateralism agreements. That is why we are continuously talking about we wouldn't be able to make the exploration towards many of the countries. I can just let you know about one point over here is, like, what we can talk about here is regional or the intergenerational inequality. Inequality between the nations. Inequality. Like at the time of G7 summit, which have just taken place 15 to 20 days before. During this meeting, what you can observe over here is you are extracting the resources from planet. You are extracting the resources from planet in order to expand the productivity. In order to expand the productivity, you would require technology which is making the disruption in the planet itself. What would you require out of this? You would require the green technology, repair and maintenance. What would you require for repair and maintenance? That is green technology. That is green technology. So you have started yourself with the planet and the extraction which is disrupting the planet. Like if you are taking out the resources from the planet, or you have to preserve the planet at the same time. For the expansion of the productivity part and the production part, you would require technology, and in order to stop the disruption, you would require technology. In both the cases, you would require technology, and who is supplying the technology? That is developed the nation. Continuously, you are making the richer nation more richer, and continuously you are degrading the countries which is already degraded. Whosoever is not under the claim of disruption even. Like if the developing countries is disrupting the planet, so they should be blamed out of it. They should be suffering the cost of the same. But who is literally suffering the cost? That is the developing country. We can talk about. So there is such kind of inequalities. We can give the example regarding it. So in the last, what we have studied over it, first of all, we need to, what is the question all about? Why we are making the favorable policies for the bilateral agreement over the multilateralism. This is with respect to 2022 year. With respect to 2022 years, continuously every country is trying to make their America first product, America first policy, and the Atmanirbhar Bharat, Make in India, these kind of policies trying to restrict themselves towards their own periphery. Okay, why we are making the preference restrictive territory or the restrictive periphery? Every country wants to obey. Second point is all about current update you can put forward. Any point you remember regarding it. And what is the need for the question? Need of the question with the keys. What is the key? With keys. Or what are the keys? That is multilateralism and the bilateralism. Next, fourth we can talk about is, now you have to answer this question with the help of comparison between the agreement. Between the agreements. Now, fifth point, this is the most important point. You do not have to favor any agreement, because multilateralism would only always be favorable from economical and the environmental point of view. So we cannot just continue making criticism about the agreement. Though we know these market forces are going to accommodate or widen the gap between the countries. Obviously, it is going to cause the inequality scenario if we continue to make technological upgradation in the developed countries. Number 5, we do not have to favor any agreement, but to give constructive approach regarding the questions. Constructive approach means giving solution, criticize and giving solution with the critical points. So this is the way to write the question. Every segment of the economy would make different perspectives. Like if you have been asked about the component of any questions, you directly have to deal with the components. As you have to write the particular format in a short and sweet way and short and brief way, you can write and start with the restrictive periphery. Why are you favoring the bilateral agreements? Number 2, you have to give the current updates within 1 or 2 statements. Number 3, you just need to know why this question has been asked in the question. Why this question has been asked with the help of keys. What are the keys of the question? On which keys we have to focus. The words and the keys we need to focus on. 4th is all about with the help of comparison between the agreements. You need to make the comparative analysis as it has been asked in the question. Why we are favoring the bilateral agreements in comparison to the multilateral agreements. Number 5 is constructive approach. Constructive approach means even if we are making the critical analysis regarding any agreement, you need to accommodate those critical analysis with the help of solution. What could be the carry forward? What could be the coming solution out of the situation? Okay, so bilateral agreement, you have already finished the point. So first question, what the question was, multilateral negotiation will be increasingly difficult in present chaotic global situation. Just because of the reason, you can give the example of our own country, that is Make in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat. We do not want to expand our territory. We are just occupying our territory with the restrictive measures so that we could not get such a huge level of fluctuation. Obviously, why every country wants to avoid the trade nowadays? Just because every kind of fluctuation could be avoided. Whatever level of production we would be able to serve, we can serve it. Every country wants to serve themselves in one or the other way. Do you think India should shift its focus towards the multilateralism? Yes, we do think about the multilateralism we should focus on. In order to represent, we have to be the part of entire global scenario, not towards 1 or 2 countries or the 5 or 6 countries. We need to represent ourselves towards the global scenario in a wholesome way. If you have to represent before 40 to 50 countries or 200 countries, you need to be a part of multilateralism agreement. This was the constructive outlay. But in order to show the preference of bilateral agreement, you need to write down the pointers which is unfavorable for the developing state if we do talk about developed countries. Next, traction in the contemporary international relation discuss. And multilateralism, you can just give a pointers regarding the outlay. Regarding the outlay, about whom we are talking about, developed state, how they are becoming more and more competitive, how they are widening the base or the gap between the countries, say developing and developed countries. Or you can make a curve of K-shape. This is widening the gap between the developed and the developing country. Continuously, if we will keep on making exploration in the multilateral aspect. So we have to be very choosy. If India has to represent in the entire global scenario, be the representative of the global scenario, but in the sector where you can perform better. but do not be the part of multilateral if you are playing the field, if you are playing the game in the sectors where you are lagging already behind. So you wouldn't be able to make the competition in those kind of sectors. It would incur losses or the deficit for the countries, which would entail the imbalances in the balance of payment. Okay. So guys, every morning you get to see the lecture from 9 to 10 and 12 to 1. We always discuss about the daily news analysis pointers. Daily news analysis, and 9 to 10, this is the static part for the economics. So do not forget to come in the session. Have a great day to all of you. If you guys having any kind of problem regarding the question, you can just let me know about the question in the comment box. You'll get the answer. Thank you so much. Have a great day to all of you.